This is a deep dive of David by Michelangelo. To begin, I'm going to start with a quick history of Michelangelo's life up until he created the sculpture David. Michelangelo was born Michelangelo Buonarroti on March 6, 1475, in the town of Caprice, which was within the Republic of Florence at the time. He was born into minor nobility in Florence, but by the time he was born, his family had mostly lost their status and his dad was working small government jobs at the time. When he was 13, his father had finally figured out that he wasn't made to work within the family business, and so his father allowed him to take an apprenticeship with Domenico Ghirlandaio in 1487. This was a relatively old time to begin an apprenticeship, but Michelangelo only did 1 year out of his 3 year apprenticeship because his teacher said that he had nothing left to learn, according to a biographer who was friends with Michelangelo. He was taken under the wing of Lorenzo de' Medici, the so-called ruler of the city, and I'll go into a little bit of the history of the Medicis in Florence in a little bit. He began to surround himself with intellectuals and poets, as those were the kind of people that Lorenzo interacted with, and he also had access to the Medici art collection, which is a very vast expanse of art from all over the world. Two relief sculptures that he created during this time were the Battle of the Centaurs and Madonna seated on a step. Battle of the Centaurs is shown on this slide. And to release his first surviving large statue was the Bacchus, and because of how successful it was, he was commissioned for the Pietà in 1498, which is the painting shown here, which shows the Virgin Mary carrying her dead son. This piece is said to have established Michelangelo's prominence as a sculptor, and because of it, he was commissioned to sculpt David in 1501. This history is important to know because Michelangelo was relatively unknown at the time of this creation, and that's something to remember when he created, because David is the sculpture that really exploded his popularity. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of the sculpture itself and Michelangelo's process, as well as this Republic of Florence at the time. Michelangelo was asked to carve out David out of a single block of marble, which had been used by two other artists previously for the commission. However, they complained about the presence of too many imperfections within the marble and stated that it was too unstable to create such a large sculpture. This piece of marble had been wasting away for 40 years and it was weather worn when Michelangelo was given it to sculpt. The statue was meant to be placed on the Duomo of Florence, and it was meant to be seen from about 80 meters off of the ground. At 26 years old, Michelangelo worked for 2 years in order to create the sculpture, and he ended up finishing it in 1504. After completing the sculpture, most of the people who saw the sculpture said it was so beautiful that it couldn't be placed so high up on the ground, so the original plan was abandoned and it was placed in the Palazzo della Signora, which is a public place which is in front of a government building. It was then later moved to the Accademia Gallery where it remains today. Now about Florence. Florence was undergoing many changes during the Renaissance. It was kind of the seat of the Renaissance. Many famous painters of the Renaissance came from Florence. But one of the most important things to know about the city or the Republic at the time was that merchant families began to hold more and more powers, as well as bankers. The most notable was the Medici family, who dominated the city. They invested in culture, artists, and architects, and while some of them never held any public office, they ruled Florence in all but name, and were similar to tyrants in other cities like Milan and Venice. However, in 1494, after the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, the one who had taken Michelangelo under his wing, French armies under Charles VIII invaded Italy and exiled the Medicis, declaring Florence a republic. They worked with the Florentine people and they established a republican government. In the time Michelangelo was sculpting David, Florence existed as a young new republic, fearful of the Medicis and as well as of foreign powers for the power they represented and for the liberty and freedom that they had now, which was threatened by these external forces. Now onto an analysis of the sculpture of David himself. David is in the classic contrapposto pose, which was an ancient Greco-Roman pose that was used again during the Renaissance and was reminiscent of the idealization of that time period by the Renaissance artists. Michelangelo made a significant choice in depicting David. He chose to depict him in the moment before slaying Goliath rather than after, like other prominent artists like Donatello. This there's a great deal of tension in this specific moment. Every muscle in David's body is tense and you can see it visible on him. The eyes are gazing off to the right in a look of great concentration, and the veins in the right hand are revealed from under the skin, drawing attention to the rock in his hand and also adding to the drama and the concentration of the scene. Some of his body parts, like the head and the right hand, have said to have been enlarged by Michelangelo, drawing attention to them and also adding to that concentration of the scene. David's nakedness is also important to discuss because David fought Goliath without any armor, and so Michelangelo's emphasis of this idea is very important. Michelangelo also chose to depict David with only his slingshot, not a sword or any other weapon, to show that David is not forceful but clever, which was kind of the idea of the Renaissance, the thinking man. That's kind of what he was trying to represent with that. The story of David and Goliath is the central symbol of the sculpture. The story represents both the triumph of good over evil and of knowledge over power. David is the underdog of the story, the small human dwarfed by Goliath the giant, but he's still able to defeat him with his cleverness. Michelangelo was very inspired by Florentine resistance against the Medicis. This is a very anti-Medician sculpture, and David became a symbol of Florence after the sculpture was revealed. He stands for liberty and freedom and the triumph of the small people over the large powers, the large forces that are trying to get rid of liberty and freedom. He's a very pro-Republican symbol. Michelangelo's David, in conclusion, is one of the most famous works of art from the Renaissance. Michelangelo makes use of ancient Greco-Roman techniques like the contrapposto pose to convey the power in the scene and emphasizes the concentration and skill of David's action rather than the strength like other sculptors had previously done. David represents the Florentine Republic's idea of itself and the ideas of freedom it stood for. After the creation of the sculpture, it represented the city of Florence or the Republic of Florence, and it still does to this day.